Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Thursday, the 20th of January. My name's Maggie Lennon and we'll start the programme as usual with the most up-to-date COVID-19 statistics. As of 2 o'clock today, there are 8,262 cases identified using either an LFD lateral flow device or PCR test. There are 27 newly reported deaths of people who've tested positive, and the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 10,149. This number only includes those who've died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,514 were in hospital last night, 43 of whom were in intensive care. As of 7:30 this morning, 4,402,666 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, 4,094,680 had received their second dose, and 3,230,767 had received a third dose or booster. The latest UK daily figures show that 153,202 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness. That's an increase of 330 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by MP for Gordon, Richard Thomson, a regular on the programme. How are you this fine evening, Richard?
Oh, as well as can be expected. What about yourself?
I'm good. We're going to start with the big story from Westminster. Just to add to the woes of the Prime Minister, it's emerging today that Tory defectors have been claiming that whips have been telling them to back the Prime Minister or lose funds. Labour's new ex-Conservative MP, Christian Wakeford, has alleged that party whips told him he would lose funding for a new high school in his constituency if he did not vote with the government. The claim came as the senior Conservative William Bragg urged MPs to report government ministers, whips and advisers to the Speaker and even the police for what he claimed was attempted blackmail of some colleagues suspected of possibly opposing Boris Johnson. Anger among Johnson critics escalated again on Thursday after sources briefed that rebels were losing their nerve. Another MP opposing Johnson denied that letters of no confidence had been withdrawn after Mr Wakeford defected to Labour. Speaking at a Labour event on Thursday, Mr Wakeford backed up the claims by William Bragg that threats involving public money were made by the whips. I was threatened that I would not get a school for Radcliffe if I didn't vote in one particular way, he said. This is a town that has not had a high school for the best part of 10 years. Mr Bragg, who chairs the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which looks into the work of government and the civil service, said whips had threatened to withdraw funding from the constituencies of MPs opposing Johnson. Speaking at the start of a hearing of that committee, attended by Steve Barclay, the Cabinet Office Minister, and Alex Chisholm, the department's most senior civil servant, Mr Bragg said he believed the actions breached the ministerial code. William Bragg asked Steve Barclay and Mr Chisholm to convey his concerns to ministers and the civil service, which they said they would. A Number 10 spokesman said, "We are not aware of any evidence to support what are clearly serious allegations. If there is any evidence to support these claims, we would look at it very carefully." The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, said allegations about potentially criminal offences would be a matter for the police. While the whipping system is long established, it is of course a contempt to obstruct members in the discharge of their duty or to attempt to intimidate a member in their parliamentary conduct by threats, he said. Richard, I'm put in mind of, I think, an opening scene in Michael Dobbs' House of Cards, where the Francis Urquhart character bundles a Tory MP into a small cupboard and threatens to not let him have the hospital that's been promised for his constituency if he doesn't support the Prime Minister. It would appear now that fiction is perhaps as true as fact?
Well, I obviously can't really speak for the Tory whips, but they do carry quite a fearsome reputation. one of the SNP whips, our role is more pastoral in terms of making sure everybody knows where they're supposed to be at what time and things like that. But it really does seem that the Tories have been putting the thumbscrews on a number of their members. And it's as brutal and as basic as I think you've described it. I mean, Boris Johnson's in the most terrible trouble, as everybody knows. And it's been quite interesting to see the gas escaping from the Conservative MPs over the last couple of weeks as they've slowly come to realise that there is no way out of this for the Prime Minister. He is finished. He is done. He is toast. He is more or less an ex-Prime Minister. And the thing is, his authority is draining out onto the floor into a puddle all around him. And, whether it's the Tory MPs that get rid of him, whether he most out of character, does a decent thing and resigns, or whether, it comes to another general election, at some point he is out because the voters have just, in England particularly, have turned. I mean, I don't think there were that many voters in Scotland were without an opinion of him. But, certainly he is, the opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Middle England has turned against him with a vengeance, and he's not coming back from it at all. But the interesting bit today is I saw he was doing his kind of Admiral Nelson bit, saying he'd seen no evidence of any kind of bribery or coercion and things like that. Now, bear in mind, this was the man that, a matter of weeks ago was telling us he did no evidence of a party going on in his back garden that we now know he was at. So I think maybe the first thing the Prime Minister should do on his departure from Downing Street is make an appointment at Specsavers, because he's got difficulty noticing a lot of things that are going on.
I think the chance of the Prime Minister doing a decent thing is pretty slim. You wouldn't recognise a decent thing if he tripped over it at a drinks party. Oh, sorry, work event. Obviously, the Speaker has suggested that these are potentially criminal issues. Nicola Sturgeon went further today and called it out and outright corruption. Now, do you think these two statements are in fact the case? Do you think it is a sign of corruption if it's proven to be true? And would it actually be something that the police might be interested in, given the police don't seem terribly interested in investigating quite a lot of things that the Prime Minister has been allegedly involved in?
I don't know if it would pass a threshold for criminality in terms of corruption, but it's certainly a corruption of the process. Public investment should be driven by need rather than by political whims. And we've already seen with their Levelling Up Fund the way that they have favoured the red wall seats in England that the Tories took from Labour at the last election. And at the northeast of Scotland, we've got a fairly prime example. The Tories are forever caterwauling about the allegedly low levels of public expenditure in Scotland, yet when they ripped up devolution to bring forward their Levelling Up Fund, they put Aberdeen City in the second lowest category, and they put Aberdeenshire in the lowest category of priority. So it's quite clear that they've been playing dirty pool with funding decisions, choosing where money is going to go, whether it's levelling up or anything else. So it would be entirely in character for them to try and make those kinds of threats to withdraw money. But ultimately, I think any MP that's worth their salt would tell the whips to go and do one in that situation. I say that advisedly as a whip myself, but really at some point you have to show a little bit of self-respect. And quite frankly, if they're prepared to try and play dice with children's futures by deciding that a presumably much needed new school is not going to go ahead because you're threatening to not vote in the right way, that's just not on. It's not how politics should be done. But it's more to the point, it's not how public investment should be done, and it's no way to run a country at all. But if it's not criminal corruption, it's definitely a corruption of the process.
Yeah. There was another part to the story as well, though, as well as the suggestion that there had been threats about withholding funds. There was also the fact that they were spinning against some of the MPs who had come out against Johnson and spreading bad stories in the media about him. I mean, the one that springs to mind is, I've forgotten the female MP who represents Melton Mowbray, where the pies are come from. They called it, was it Piegate or something? They suggested that she was the leader of the rebellion, which she claims she's not. So it isn't just about potentially destroying someone's reputation within their own constituency by withholding funds. It's destroying people's personal reputations as well. But I guess Boris Johnson isn't really above that, is he? He's done these sort of things
No,
before. He's throwing people under the
absolutely
bus.
not. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Alicia Cairns is one of the brightest and the best of the 2019 Tory intake. You know, she's somebody who's got a bit of substance about her, and I don't think with the best will in the world you can say that about all of them. But this is just them eating their young almost. You know, the priority here for those around Boris Johnson is to, well, for Boris Johnson is to save Boris Johnson. I'm not sure that all of those round about him are necessarily going to survive. They're headed for a front set of bus wheels in the not too distant future, if we can believe all that we read about that. But, you know, it wasn't even just Alicia Cairns, it was Douglas Ross as well, remember, just a few days, just last week, Jacob Rees-Mogg, after Douglas Ross said that Boris should go, was saying, well, Douglas Ross is a bit of a lightweight figure. Now, for once, I'm able to agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg. I think Douglas Ross is a bit of a lightweight, but, you know, nevertheless, I think it just explodes how desperate they are, but it blows up a much, much bigger issue here as well from a Scottish perspective. You know, people can look at the chaos that's going on down here. It's impossible to imagine Scotland, because of the way our public debate happens, to elect anyone as chaotic as Boris Johnson to any kind of senior position of power. But the bit about the Douglas Ross story, about him being a lightweight, that's really illuminating for me is it shows the utter contempt that even the Scottish Conservatives are held in by their UK counterparts. That, you know, we're used to getting treated like that, but, you know, we're also used to seeing the Scottish Tories being bigged up massively by them to make them seem like figures of substance, you know, to a level well beyond that which their talents could tolerably support by themselves. Ruth Davidson being the prime example. But that's how they are actually seen by the likes of Rees-Mogg and others. And fundamentally, if they can't get a union of equals working properly within their own party, just how on earth do they expect to persuade Scots that we're actually living in a union of equals right now?
Indeed. Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about the story in the coming days. I think there's a suggestion that the report is meant to be published tomorrow on the investigation into the parties. I don't know if you know that that's still the timetable.
No, I mean, that's been the rumour all week, but then there was more information leaked out about an email that Dominic Cummings said was sent. And I did actually wonder for a while if their strategy was just to keep leaking more information about new parties to Sue Gray, just to keep delaying and delaying and delaying and delaying until, you know, there was an election time or something like that.
Yeah,
But no,
kicking it into the
I
long
don't know if
grass.
it's going to come out. I don't know if it's coming out tomorrow or not. But once it does, I think the last remaining fig leaf for Conservative MPs to hesitate on acting on this will be gone, and they will really be out in the open, and it will be decision time for them.
Oh, the image of Boris Johnson in a fig leaf is one that I really didn't need to have in my head. Anyway,
Sorry.
moving on. Most people admitted to adult care homes in Scotland will no longer have to self-isolate for 2 weeks under new guidance issued to care home operators. People transferring from hospital to care homes will no longer need to isolate if they have a negative PCR test in the previous 48 hours, so long as they've had no symptoms of a respiratory virus and have not been exposed to COVID-19 over the previous 14 days. The isolation period for care home residents testing positive for COVID-19 or for close contacts of COVID cases is also being cut from 14 days to 10 days to bring restrictions closer to those for the general public. The measures are being taken in line with clinical and public health advice, recognising the high levels of vaccination in care homes and the need to balance the risk and impact of infection for people living in a communal setting against the potential harms caused to residents by long periods of self-isolating. Residents who have been in hospital for acute overnight stays will also no longer need to isolate and will not need a negative PCR test, provided there is no clinical reason to think that they have COVID. I'm wondering if this is quite a brave move in some respects, just because obviously what really triggered the decimation of care homes was sending people home from hospital into care homes at the start of the pandemic without checking or being concerned if they had COVID. So it's a kind of political hot potato, balancing very much this idea that people in care homes desperately need to have contact with their families, but also the risk that this could make things worse again. So do you think this is a sensible move, and how difficult do you think this has been to make this decision?
I think this will be an incredibly difficult decision for the reasons that you've just given. obviously there was at the outset of the pandemic, nobody really knew how it was going to hit us or how hard it was going to hit us. And so an awful lot of effort was put into making sure that hospitals were as free as they possibly could be. And we saw, although the inquiry will in the end reveal everything about this, I'm sure. We saw higher levels of deaths in care homes than might otherwise have been expected, partly because we believe care homes weren't testing. So I think there's an acute sensitivity around care homes. But nevertheless, I think that there is such a because of that, everybody will be being really, really careful about the care homes. But there's been such an adverse impact on older people in care, particularly, but especially if they're suffering from Alzheimer's disease and the like, that people have deteriorated much more quickly, and it has been particularly hard on families. So I welcome any decision that can be taken where there's an appropriate balance of risk there that allows people to spend as much time as they ever possibly can with their older relatives in these settings. So yes, I'm very, very happy that people will be able to get back to see their relatives more quickly because of this. I think hopefully sensible and steady progress back to normality.
Well, I'm sure they'll be keeping an eye just to make sure that they haven't done something prematurely. The Scottish Government has published its blueprint for future transport investment. The second Strategic Transport Projects Review makes 45 recommendations under 6 key themes, which seek to make transport in Scotland more sustainable and support people to make better, more informed choices on how they travel. When implemented, the changes and measures will play a key role in helping to make the country fairer and greener by tackling climate change, reducing inequalities, and improving our health and well-being. The recommendations include mass transit in our biggest city regions of Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen. Clyde Metro represents a multi-billion investment which, when complete, could better connect over 1.5 million people to employment, education and health services in and around Glasgow. Plans for Edinburgh and South East Scotland mass transit and Aberdeen rapid transit will also be developed. Rural transport and island communities will have a continuing investment in ferry renewals, improving port infrastructure and connections from ferry terminals to other types of public transport to reduce car reliance, enhancing island connectivity and making safety improvements on rural trunk roads where accident rates and severities are typically higher. Decarbonation of public transport is also featured. Transport is Scotland's biggest carbon emitter, and the recommendations emphasise decarbonisation and behaviour changes for ferries, rail and buses, as well as increasing the shift to zero-emission vehicles. On improving active travel infrastructure, people are being encouraged to walk, wheel and cycle more often, cutting carbon emissions and improving health and well-being, particularly of children, while supporting sustainable economic growth. Transforming freight will occur by developing a net zero freight and logistics network for Scotland that would encourage the switch from road to rail or water and reduce the overall distance travelled, including a review of rail freight terminals and hubs. These investments will help reduce overall demand for private vehicles, improve accessibility to employment, education, healthcare and leisure amenities, and strengthen strategic transport connections to, from and within rural areas as well as across the UK. Richard, it all sounds great, but the first thing that strikes me is that the statement that's about helping people make better choices. If there isn't a public transport alternative, then there is no choice for people. And certainly in some parts of rural Scotland, the availability of public transport is really, really poor. I don't know how it is in your region, but do you think this is getting it right, or should it be actually more back to basics? Just get more buses on the road?
Well, I'm not fully across the document, but what I have seen is quite high level. But you make an excellent point there that in large parts of Scotland, including large parts of the northeast of Scotland, which and the seat that I represent, a car for many people is a necessity because public transport is not always a frequent option or a reliable option in terms of journey times that you're able to take. So, as I say, while I'm not across all of the detail in this, there are some things that jump out at me, like an investment in buses for a rapid transport network in Aberdeen, which I'm sure will be welcomed. There's investment in the railways and the rail corridor that's so vital for us for getting to the south. But one of the things that I do like and what I've seen is the continued commitment to investing over and above maintaining them, the trunk road network, because there are parts of Scotland, and the northeast is one, the southwest is another, where there are major strategic roads of great importance that really aren't fit for the purpose to which they're being used. Now, fair enough, traffic levels have kind of dropped off the pandemic. We maybe will never go quite back to living and working in the way that we did before. But for the last few miles of our journey, the roads are still going to be very important. And it's not roads that we're going to be finding no need for in the future. It's going to be the polluting methods that we use of transporting people and goods down them. So I'm very I'm encouraged by what I've seen so far in my limited view of it. But fundamentally, yes, we need to be making sure that we're providing a good and useful public transport network for people in outlying and rural areas, because there's a danger that we end up focusing far too much of our activities in terms of public services and education and commerce on our cities. Good broadband connections can help to overcome that, but there is no substitute for many things, from simply being able to physically transport goods and people to the places they need to be. And if you don't have a public transport network that is comprehensive enough, because it can't wash its face financially to do that, then you need to make sure that the other alternatives are in place. And I see some evidence of that in the document today.
Yeah, well, I agree that, we may not be working in the same way in the future that we have done, and that more home working might be a future which keeps the use of private cars down a little. You've just mentioned broadband connections. So in the areas where there is less public transport, often are the very same areas where actually broadband connections are really poor and really don't sustain this working from home culture. So that is a concern to me. And the other bit of the paper that I kind of raised an eyebrow in was the issue around freight, talking about putting it onto rail and water. Well, there are huge parts of Scotland that really aren't near any waterways that are useful, or indeed railways. So again, rural and remote Scotland doesn't seem to be, that's fine for the central belt and it's fine for the corridors up from the main cities in England. But, beyond Perth, we're talking about real issues around that. So it just feels to me that rural communities are not really, I don't think, particularly well addressed in this paper.
Okay, well, let's take rail. I mean, you're not going to do an awful lot of goods transport by rail, really, in the central belt, unless it's particularly, heavy goods, or there's or it's much easier in general terms to transport things by road. But to go north of Perth, for some years now, Tesco, other supermarkets are available, of course, but they've been using rail freight to take goods north up to Inverness, and that takes dozens of lorries every day off the A9 from that kind of modal shift. Now, in the northeast of Scotland, we've got some rail interchanges there for freight near Inverurie, out towards near Huntly and in Aberdeen. And hand on heart, are these interchanges being used as much as they could be? Absolutely not. So the more goods that we can get from, there's often an awful lot of manufacture or production of goods, whether it's agriculture, food and drink, or anything else. There's an awful lot of primary and secondary economic production happens in parts of rural Scotland near or close to railways. And if the more lorries that we can take off the road for the longest part of their journey and get onto rail, that is a good thing. And I think we've got tremendous potential for that, particularly in the northeast. So I'll be looking to study more of the detail on this. But certainly if we can get more whisky from distilleries and more of the produce from our farms and things off of the lorries and onto trains to the major distribution hubs to take them on to where they're going, that's a good thing. And it's probably rural Scotland that would see the most benefit from that, I think.
Well, in the headlines of the report that I've read, what I didn't see at all was any kind of sense of a gendered perspective on this. And actually, public transport is a feminist issue because if you look at, excuse me, families with one car, very often that car is used by the main breadwinner, who's more likely to be the man in the family rather than the woman. So once again, you have an issue where often women find that they have a greater need for public transport, and that's everywhere. That's not just in rural Scotland. But I didn't see anything about that, so I don't know whether that's been taken into account. But I think maybe you've not been able to look at the huge detail. I only really saw the headlines, but that's something that I think I'd want to dig into a bit further. Moving on and over to our neighbours across the Irish Sea. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss will travel to Brussels on Monday with a target of agreeing a deal with the EU on the post-Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland by the end of February. The two sides have agreed that a window of opportunity for an agreement will close when campaigning starts for May's elections to the Northern Ireland Assembly. Maros Šefčovič, the EU's Brexit Commissioner, who will host Truss in Brussels on Monday, told MEPs in a private briefing that there had been a positive tone to his discussions with the Foreign Secretary at her official country residence last week. Truss took responsibility for Brexit issues after David Frost's resignation in January. But for all that Truss had expressed confidence she'd be able to build momentum in favour of a deal, he said that there was as yet no sign of a change in the UK's negotiating positions. Sources said the Commissioner had been surprised and concerned that Truss had regurgitated Frost's demands for a dispute system similar to that within the trade deal, the complete removal of checks on goods from Great Britain destined for Northern Ireland, and a rethink on the current system of EU-approved approval of subsidies, known in Brussels as state aid. He reiterated that the thorough overhaul of the current protocol, which keeps Northern Ireland in the single market for goods and draws a customs border down the Irish Sea, was not possible. He told MEPs the EU had also shown it could speed up its approval system for state aid notifications. Despite these concerns, intensive talks have been continuing this week between the two sides, with concerns the protocol could become a political talking point in the Northern Ireland Assembly elections. Richard, you're shadow spokesman for Northern Ireland. What does Truss really think she's going to achieve? I mean, there is an agreement. It's in the legislation. What does she really think she's going to achieve? And how much impact do you think this will have on the elections in May?
In short, I don't know what she's going to achieve or what she thinks she's going to achieve, because the fundamental calculus of it is unchanged. That if the United Kingdom is no longer in alignment with the single market or the customs union, that creates a trade border. And that trade border can either be in the English Channel, it can be in the Irish Sea, or in the island of Ireland. And basically, after saying he wouldn't, Boris Johnson laid it right down the middle of the Irish Sea. So none of the fundamentals of the argument have changed. What I think has maybe changed is that people have been able to see how the protocol has worked in practice, and broadly speaking, businesses in Northern Ireland are supportive of the protocol. I mean, the Northern Irish economy is doing pretty well at the moment, and it's had the same COVID to deal with as everybody else. The one changing factor from the rest of the UK is it's in the single market, and the rest of the UK isn't. So I think a lot of folk in Northern Ireland are taking quite a pragmatic view of this. Business certainly is. People are reorientating their purchases. They're just changing their suppliers, changing the kinds of products they buy. Medicines was going to be a real issue. And the EU seems to have moved on that to find a way whereby checks on medicines, it really wasn't benefiting anybody for that to be there. So bear in mind, that this was a protocol that the UK signed up to. I think there are sort of pragmatic nibbles around the edges that can be made. Another one that can be made, for example, would be for the UK to align on sanitary and phytosanitary checks for food and animal products, which would straight away remove about 80% of the goods checks that will need to happen. It would also, incidentally, make it an awful lot easier, if this was a UK-wide agreement, for Scottish food producers to get exporting to Europe. Again, it would take away so much of the paperwork that we never had to deal with before, but now has to be dealt with. It would also revive the Scottish seed potato sector. That previously we exported millions upon millions of pounds worth of seed potatoes to Europe, and overnight that trade has effectively been stopped, not because the quality of the product has gone down, but simply because the UK will not sign up to the alignment, and therefore the assurance is no longer there, even though that the products are the same quality that they always were. So I think Liz Truss, the calculus hasn't changed, but I think what's really interesting is to see this in the context of who's going to replace Boris Johnson. And I think that she's going to want to throw some red meat of her own to the Tory backbenchers. But whether or not, but I think Northern Ireland has certainly been shown to be expendable as far as Tory unionists are concerned, in terms of, big promises will be made, but, there's always that. As soon as they no longer need the votes of the unionists in Parliament, then the Tories go and do what's best for them rather than what's necessarily best for Northern Ireland or what's been hoped for by the unionists who back them. So I am really not quite certain what she's going to do. I am fairly sure it will be governed by what she thinks makes her look good to the electorate that really matters to her right now, which is that within the Conservative Party when they're looking to replace Boris Johnson. And there was a little bombshell, if I could call it that, this week. There was a thought that the government was planning to table an amendment to a bill in Northern Irish elections to allow dual mandates between Stormont and Westminster, which a move which was thought to favour the DUP. But there was a backlash by all the other parties in Northern Ireland, and that amendment in the Lords is now going to be withdrawn, which is kind of a letdown, if you believe these things, for the Democratic Unionist Party. So if they've let them down once this week, I think that the UK government may be about to do that again because there needs to be a protocol of some kind. It doesn't necessarily need to be this protocol looking exactly like this. But the point I've been making throughout this as the SNP's Northern Ireland spokesperson is that the withdrawal agreement from the UK and the EU doesn't work for anybody. The big problem in Northern Ireland is the symbolism of having that border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But economically, the terms in which we've left the European Union aren't working for us in Scotland either. And quite frankly, whether Scotland's in the Union or out of the Union, the best solution for us is to have as free trade as possible with all other parts of these islands, including England and Wales, and of course Ireland, north and south. And the best way to do that is with the UK and Scotland in or out of the UK, as I say, to be in alignment with the single market and the customs union again.
And do you think that alignment? I mean, I was interested what you were saying about the alignment over bio issues. Do you think that's likely? I mean, that does sound very pragmatic. If you were a betting
Yeah,
man, do you think that's something that the UK government might quietly just introduce?
no, they only ever do the sensible thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. And if they do that, then they've lost a bit more red meat to throw to their backbenches, and it's viewed as a climb down. But it would be the most sensible thing to do, and it would take away most of the friction that there is currently around the border. I mean, right now it's probably as easy to send a container of ice cream from Galloway to South Korea than it is to send a block of cheese across the sea to Larne. That's the kind of difficulties that we've landed ourselves. And, to put ourselves in the shoes of some Northern Irish unionists for a minute, I just cannot believe, it's just quite remarkable that any government that notionally calls itself a unionist would separate Northern Ireland from the island, from Great Britain in the way that they've done it. It's just beyond comprehension that any unionist would do that and create an internal border effectively. It's just absolutely bizarre. But, we're all paying the price for the terms in which the UK has left the European Union. And as I say, Scotland in the UK, or as I fervently hope, out as quickly as possible. The best future for us all is to be back in alignment with the single market and the customs union and just minimise these issues, which takes us kind of back as far as we can to the prospectus of 2014, if that's possible.
Well, sticking with the EU for now, a cross-party group of MEPs has called for a large-scale election observation mission to Hungary, citing fears about democratic standards. Hungarians go to the polls on the 3rd of April in parliamentary elections that will decide the fate of the incumbent Prime Minister Viktor Orban, whose last 12 years in office have seen tighter executive control over the courts, a withering of independent media, and widespread concerns about corruption and cronyism. In a letter to the head of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which checks electoral probity in 57 mostly European and Central Asian states, The MEPs called for a full-scale election observation mission to Hungary. The ODIHR, part of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has begun a needs assessment of the mission it should send. During Hungary's 2018 elections, it sent a limited mission, meaning it did not undertake systematic observation of voting, counting and tabulation of results. The Warsaw-based body, however, can choose to send a larger mission to carry out wider checks if it deems there is limited confidence amongst election stakeholders in the election administration. After the 2018 vote, where Orban's Fidesz party won a two-thirds majority, the OSCE observers criticised hostile and xenophobic rhetoric, a campaign that limited space for substantive debate and where public television clearly favoured the ruling coalition and the government's use of public funds to tilt the election in its favour. MEPs cited these issues and also raised the alarm about new voter registration rules, which they say make it easier for people to use fictitious addresses. It's widely feared that these rules will be instrumentalised by the ruling party to increase its voter base in particularly contested regions, the letter says. There's quite a lot in there that you could lay at the feet of the British government as well, actually, in terms of what it's up to. But do you think it's time that maybe the EU just quietly asked Hungary to leave the party?
I think it's incumbent on any member state to uphold the treaties and the obligations that come with EU membership. But I think there is a danger that in throwing out a country which is not or heading towards serious issues of non-compliance, as Hungary might be at the moment, simply strengthens the hands of those who are departing from those liberal norms and sets back the cause of having a liberal, open, democratic society, a liberal, open, democratic society there. So yeah, it's very, very easy to go for that absolute purity. I think what would be better is to, I think sending the observers is something that probably should happen. But fundamentally, I think what we've got to hope for is for us, the civil society in Hungary, to begin to assert itself and decide whether it wants to be European and Western European in outlook, or whether it wants to slide back away from those sorts of democratic norms that are an integral part of being in the EU. It's not been an encouraging few years under Viktor Orban, and I think this is simply this call for observers in the election is simply a reflection of that. But as you suggest, the UK is no longer the gleaming bastion that it would like to see itself in terms of measures to introduce voter ID. And think about that. The UK government is against you showing ID to show that you've been vaccinated, but it'll make you show ID to go and cast a vote. It's just ridiculous. We've got very, very slack and sloppy election funding rules now. We're absolutely wide open to misinformation and disinformation because we don't adequately regulate our public information sphere. We're undermining the state public service broadcaster, or the UK government is doing that. So there's all kinds of areas where our democracy here is being squeezed, and where the flow of information and the ability to register an opinion in a ballot box is being made much, much more difficult. And but we're still in a better place than Hungary is. And I think that the more that can be done to try and bring countries like Hungary back into the fold and back towards the sort of norms that you would expect to see across Western Europe, that's the big challenge. And I just fear that if Hungary were to be removed, it would be very much a last resort, but it would make it, that job of bringing it back to these kind of democratic norms much, much harder.
Well, voting rights is not just concerning Hungary, or indeed concerns in this country. It's also keeping the American president up at night. Joe Biden and congressional Democrats suffered twin legislative defeats late on Wednesday in their push to toughen voting rights protections in the run-up to this November's midterm elections that will determine control of Congress in 2023. In back-to-back votes late on Wednesday, Senate Republicans first blocked Democrats' move to advance the voting rights legislation towards passage, It was the fifth time in less than a year that they did so. They employed the decades-old filibuster rule to stop the legislation which requires the cooperation of at least 60 of the Senate's 100 members to keep bills alive. The Senate is currently split 50-50. In lightning speed, Democrat Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer then moved to revamp the filibuster rule by lowering the 60-vote threshold to 50. This time it was not Republicans, but Schumer's own Democrats, Conservatives Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who put the final nail in the coffin by voting against the rules change. With this year-long initiative stymied, even after Republican-controlled states enacted bills that experts said were designed to suppress voting in federal elections, especially amongst black, Hispanic and poor voters, the focus turned to a nascent bipartisan effort to pass far more limited election reforms. Let us not sink into the abyss of voter suppression. Give us the ballot, Schumer implored before the rules change vote, but he swayed to sway Manchin and Sinema. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell warned against changes to the filibuster rule, saying that altering it would shatter the Senate for short-term power. However, between 2016 and 2020, Senator McConnell scrapped the filibuster on several occasions himself, when blocking the then-President Barack Obama's nominee to replace the late Justice Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court, and then to force ex-President Donald Trump's three nominees through the Senate. Now with the 2022 midterm elections heating up, that will see the election of all 435 House of Representative members and one-third of the Senate, the partisan fighting is only expected to deepen. Senator Bernie Sanders left the Senate chamber late on Wednesday, telling reporters that the Democrats need to go on the offensive. The voting rights bill that was passed by the House but buried last night by the Senate would have established minimal federal voting standards so that any registered voter could request a mail-in ballot. It would also have established at least 2 weeks of early voting and expanded use of ballot drop boxes that make voting more convenient in many areas. It's just over a year since Biden's inauguration, and this really is a blow because this was one of his big ticket items, especially after the debacle over the election when he won over Trump, because there was so much concern about the fact that voter suppression, there was evidence of it. So he must be bitterly disappointed, and you do wonder, what has he achieved in this first year?
I think others are probably better qualified than I am to put chalk on the board, but I think fundamentally nobody will be more disappointed than Joe Biden that his main achievement in the first year is simply not being Donald Trump. I mean, we should all, give a jump for joy at that. But, he went in with very, very high hopes behind him. He's had to do his best to try and heal what had become quite a very divided nation with some very, very divisive politics that had up until then been quite alien to the US process. But I think this is something that they need to get sorted because, looking in as an observer, it's really hard to imagine that if you were trying to design an electoral system for a democracy as sophisticated as the United States, that this is the system that you would have and the means of administering that you have. It all seems very, very spatchcocked and held together with gaffer tape and twine. And, some of the measures like, having a federally mandated holiday to make sure that people are free to vote, increasing the amount of time that you're able to vote ahead of the election, making it easier for mail-in ballots to take place, having some Justice Department oversight so it's not left of the process, so it's not left entirely to states to come up with their own idiosyncrasies, which is a system that is ripe and open for abuse, and also having some kind of nationwide standards in terms of how voter districts are designed to minimise the opportunities of gerrymandering. That all seems pretty basic stuff, and it's stuff that, we were talking a minute ago about, the flaws in in the political ecosystem here. But these are all kind of things, apart from the holiday bit, that's all stuff that we take pretty much for granted here. And it doesn't compromise the local administration of ballots through our local authorities with the chief execs or senior council officers working as independent returning officers. But, to bring in these sorts of measures, it seems to me it oughtn't to be controversial, I wouldn't have thought, unless you have a partisan interest in trying to stop certain types of people voting. And fundamentally, I started this from the point of view of being fundamentally democratic about this. We shouldn't be making it more difficult for people to cast their franchise. We should be making it easier in
Indeed.
terms of physically casting a vote, but also making it easier for them to follow the issues and to make informed choices when those opportunities come around at election time.
But I mean, the real problem is with the midterms coming up. I mean, Biden's personal popularity has slumped. The Republicans are smelling blood, and he's clearly got problems with some of his own conservative side of the Democratic Party. I don't think there has been a Democratic presidency that has controlled the House and Senate for the whole of the 4-year term in about 60 years. If he loses control of the Senate, and it is 50-50, then that's very serious. He might even lose control of Congress. He doesn't have much of a majority there either. So I think this has real big implications. If you can't get a major piece of what appears to be just genuinely good legislation through, you can't control your own conservative wing of the party. The voters are going to feel pretty shaky about him come November. Do you think there's any risk that he might lose control of both Senate and Congress?
I think there's always that risk. But equally, I think when political games like this are being played, that sometimes you can underestimate the wisdom of the public. And I think one of the things that, whether they would regard themselves as being left, right, or somewhere in the middle, is that the public have got a fairly low tolerance threshold for obvious game playing and obstructionism. And it's just as possible that that could backfire, and it could end up with a sufficiency of reliable Democrats in order to help the president pass his legislation. I mean, we saw that to an extent back in Scotland in 2007. The SNP was running a minority government by the narrowest of margins. It was always finding a way to wriggle through the cracks and get things passed. But the public generally liked what they saw and rewarded the SNP after that with a majority. It wasn't all down, I think, to the success of the SNP, although clearly if the SNP hadn't been successful, that wouldn't have happened. But I think people kind of looked askance at the antics of some of the other parties and trying to block things, particularly around about budget time, and said, we see you, and we're going to give the SNP a remedy to govern as we would want them for the next few years. There's every chance that the same thing could happen there. But if Biden does lose control of the Hill, then he's in for a fairly torrid time. But I'm sure he's got effective political operators there who'll be able to offer some pork in the direction of those who are being obstructive, and maybe try and work on some of the softer Republicans as well.
10 months to go, so let's hope it's not kind of game over yet.
There's plenty of time for brickmanship in that.
Indeed. Much more humanitarian story now. At least one child has been killed in northern Syria after a storm blanketed tented camps in snow and brought freezing temperatures, compounding the misery of thousands of people displaced by the Mediterranean country's decade-long war. The child died and its mother was in intensive care after snow caused their tent to collapse as a result of the storm that struck on January the 18th. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said 362 tents have been damaged in the region as of January 19th, and more than 400 families have been affected, with 2 children being hospitalised due to the cold. The United Nations has also warned about flooding once the snow melts. The United Nations also reported that families had to be evacuated in the northern camp of Abraz, one of the worst affected places. The storm also disrupted life elsewhere in Syria. In government-held areas, universities and other educational institutions postponed exams. Syria's ports are temporarily closed. Syria's civil war has killed hundreds of thousands of people, forced millions to flee their homes, creating one of the worst refugee crises since World War II. Despite that, I don't think have the British government said if they're going to take any more Syrians through their resettlement scheme. We took 20,000 over 5 years. My understanding was that that would be reviewed. The 5 years is now up. But I haven't heard whether the UK government is intending taking any more. Has that something that's been discussed in Parliament?
Not to my knowledge, but it could easily have happened without me necessarily seeing that, since that's not the brief and the area that I cover. But I certainly hope that the British government offers the support to local authorities to take in more, because we have a moral responsibility to do that, I believe. And let's not forget, the circumstances in this report are utterly tragic. But let's not forget the origins of the wars. I hold no brief for the Assad regime at all. It's as murderous and brutal as any that the Middle East has ever had. Countries in the Middle East have ever had the misfortune to be ruled by. But the people are living in camps because of political instability that we have had a hand in creating. And when Nigel Farage and his ilk are standing on the white cliffs of Dover shouting "Go back" at the little boats trying to come across, this is this is the effect of that political instability that we have, through our government's actions in years past, have contributed towards. So, quite apart from the common humanity and that morality aspect, we have a responsibility as well. One of the things of which I was most, I won't say proud, but happy to have been able to do was when I was the co-leader of Aberdeenshire Council. We took in 50 Syrian families to Aberdeenshire, and the project to integrate them into wider society, it's now regarded as a kind of exemplar of its kind. I'm really, really proud that at that time of real difficulty and tragedy, we stepped up, and I'm sure that local authorities all over Scotland and further afield also have the capacity, if the resources are put their way, in order to do that. And I think it's we have that moral responsibility, but we've also got that common humanitarian responsibility to
Well,
do our share, because many other countries are doing far more
well,
proportionately
indeed they are. And
than
indeed,
we
all
are.
32 local authorities in Scotland took in Syrian families, and all 32 local authorities in Scotland have said they're willing to take in Afghans once the Afghan programmes get up and running properly. Closer to home, a mobile operating theatre supported by more than 2.3 million Scottish Government funding will enable almost 350 elective surgeries to go ahead for patients in Orkney and Shetland. The specialist unit has opened in Gilbert Bain Hospital in Shetland and will allow cataract and orthopaedic joint operations to go ahead for patients who have faced delays in receiving treatment due to the pandemic and may have otherwise had to travel to the mainland for their procedure. This includes some operations that have never been performed before on the island. A mobile MRI unit has also been used to enable patients to have all appropriate scans undertaken prior to surgery in the additional theatre capacity. The unit, which will remain on site until June 2022, will also support theatre activity from April during the second phase of essential building works in the main hospital building. So am I to assume then that this mobile unit is only temporary until additional theatre capacity is made available to the Northern Isles?
That's certainly what it sounds like from the news that you've been reading out. But I think it's quite an innovative approach. If they're able to provide that while we're building permanent capacity, that's good. But also, I can well believe that there's been a fair amount of disruption. I know that there's been disruption in all parts of the NHS because of COVID, obviously, in terms of some elective surgeries. And Aberdeen Royal Infirmary is a hospital where an awful lot of treatments are carried out for folk coming from Orkney and Shetland because of the air links and, of course, the ferry service which comes in from the Northern Isles into Aberdeen. So, if I think it's a good thing that is being the local health board's clearly looking at this pragmatically. It's had the support of the Scottish Government to do this, and I hope it can get through the backlog that's clearly there in terms of orthopaedic and ophthalmic surgery that needs to take place. But I'm sure everyone will look forward to the permanent development being able to become operational, so to speak, at the hospitals in due course.
Well, we shouldn't be surprised, of course, because we saw how quickly the Louisa Jordan Hospital was up and running in a remarkable time. In fact, all the Nightingale hospitals across the UK. So it's actually good to know that in terms of providing health services for people, that there can be this sort of instantaneous kind of mobile response, and it's maybe something we'll see sort of pop up hospitals elsewhere in Scotland. There's been legislation to end the harmful practice of setting glue traps brought forward by the Scottish Government in order to protect animal welfare. The Scottish Animal Welfare Commission undertook a review of the use of glue traps and concluded that there are significant animal welfare issues related to their use, not only for rodents, but also for the non-target species, such as wild birds. Given this, the Scottish Government intends to implement a full ban and will seek stakeholders' views through a consultation before bringing forward legislation during this parliamentary term. Christine Graham, MSP, a campaigner for a ban on these traps, said, "I'm delighted that the Scottish Government has committed to a ban on these inhumane traps in Scotland." It's just an aside there, Richard, but I guess there's quite a few rats in Westminster that maybe we'd quite like to see trapped.
What can you possibly mean? No, actually, there is.
It's a good news story.
There's an awful lot of there's an awful lot of pest control devices around Westminster, and it's a scurrilous rumour to suggest that the whips are one of them. But you quite often see rodents scurrying about here and there on the underground and in Westminster, being close to the Thames. But I think this is a positive move. I mean, glue traps are fairly rudimentary; they're very crude devices, and the small animal walks onto it and gets stuck and will probably die from hunger or dehydration, particularly if it's not being checked. But once it's there, it's not getting off it. But it's the other species that could be killed as well. If a bird gets on there, that's clearly not the target or the intended victim of a glue trap. So I think there are more humane methods of pest control, which are quicker and more effective. And yes, I think that this is a positive step forward.
A late story that's just come in is the news that the botched idea of the bridge or tunnel between Scotland and Northern Ireland had a feasibility study, and that feasibility study has cost the taxpayer almost £1 million. SNP Shadows Scotland Secretary Mary Black said, "We knew from the beginning this wouldn't happen, and now it has been revealed that the UK government wasted close to £1 million of taxpayers' money on a feasibility study on its unworkable, doomed from the get-go idea. This just goes to show the Tories' warped spending priorities. How many lateral flow tests could this have bought, or nurses' salaries paid, or PPE purchased for those on the front line in the pandemic?" However, as daft as this idea was, it still promised to put 20 billion of investment into the Scottish and Northern Irish economies. So what the SNP are calling for are saying, well, if there was a plan to do something to put £20 million worth of investment into these two economies, is that investment still going to come? Should we hold our breath for it, Richard?
No, but I spoke on a motion to this effect at the SNP conference, and yes, it was never going to be done even if a bridge or a tunnel had been technically feasible, it was never going to happen on the budget that was there. But if there was a spare 20 billion to burn, give it to the Scottish Government, the Northern Irish Government, and let us get on with building the sort of investments that, transport investments of the kind we were talking about at the top of the show in terms of improving, the links there. And I'm sure we could do an awful lot better than what was only ever a device to try and get Boris Johnson off the hook over the self-inflicted problems in the Northern Ireland Protocol. My favourite response to the whole bridge thing, though, actually came from More Than Seafood. They're a restaurant company in Northern Ireland with a couple of really nice looking seafood restaurants, and they went on Twitter after the announcement was made and said, basically print this out, cut out and keep it, free seafood for life for our restaurants, for anyone who travels over here to eat in our restaurants using the bridge or the tunnel. I think they did that, a fairly certain reality that this was never ever going to come to fruition. But now we're back on Planet Sensible and talking about the transport's improvements that can happen. If the UK government's going to get its chequebook out and give us some of the resources back that we've put into the UK Treasury over the years, then let's sit down and have a serious discussion about that. And I guarantee it won't involve bridges or tunnels between Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Well, I reckon Joe or Josephine Public could have told you that it wasn't a feasible idea for the price of the cost of a price of a pint of Guinness, never mind 900,000 of taxpayers' money. That's the end of the programme tonight. We've covered a lot of stories. Thank you very much, Richard, for joining me. As always, we remind you that it takes money to keep Broadcasting Scotland on air. We were mentioning earlier about independent journalism. If you are a fan of independent journalism, if you think there's a need for independent journalism in Scotland, and oh my goodness, the answer to that question is yes, there is, then please think about making a regular donation. Go online to www.broadcastingscotland.scot/donate and see if you can't make a regular donation. It's been a pleasure. I shall see you again next week. Have a good evening.